Hello and welcome to Simon Says Artwork. In this video I'm going to be doing a life drawing pose. I'm not going to be doing it, I'm going to be drawing it. I'm going to be using again my little tin of goodies here, and from this tin I will mainly be using these little charcoal sticks. So I'll be using this, but I'll be drawing on an A1 presentation pad, which is smooth paper, so there's very little texture or tooth to the paper, but it's still quite nice for a large scale to draw on. So that's what we're going to be doing today. So okay, let's get started. So to start off with, I try to get a good look at what I'm actually trying to understand and render onto the page. I was once told to take half of the amount of time of the pose just looking and not drawing. And I have done that a few times and it does work. But on this occasion I start off with drawing a loose, light oval for the head. I do a horizontal line for the direction of the shoulders. And then from each end of that line I start to pull down a box for the frame, for the main torso of the model. And this also gives me not just the breadth of the body, more it's trying to capture the distance where the two arms are fallen down and crossed across the body. So I'm trying to get the box of the in between the arms, because they're creating a sort of window through which you can see the torso. So this line which I'm getting down from the head is actually trying to understand how much space I'm able to see between the arms. That may sound like an abstract idea, but I really do think that if you're doing life drawing, it's worth trying to think in a more abstract way. A lot of the time, life drawing can be very distracting as far as how to draw the face, how to get the measurements correct, whether to add a lot of shadow or whether you should do it on toned paper so that you have the opportunity to use chalk for the light and the highlights, I should say. But otherwise, there is a lot of opportunity to just go for abstract marks. Now, on this occasion, I'm trying to get a mainly a line drawing. It's not especially realistic, but you can see certain features fairly well rendered, which I'm trying to purposely achieve within the time constraint that I'm given. Now the camera goes in and out of focus a little bit from time to time, so you have to forgive me for that. The face is not the most important part, but it is very difficult to avoid. So you can see here that I've already started to go in and I make very light marks for the eye sockets, and then for the bottom of the nose where the nostrils are, and then for the lips or for the top lip, because those are all shadow areas. The eye sockets are very rarely lit. They're always sunken into the head so that they catch shadow. Beneath the nose where the nostrils are, it's very rare that the light is going upwards so that you get highlights where the nostrils are on the nose. So that's an area of shadow. And then the top lip is also facing downward as opposed to the bottom lip, which partly faces upward. And that means that the top lip is usually darker than the bottom lip. It's not always the case, but fairly often. I'd say 9 times out of 10. But if you're going out of 100, then maybe, 90 times out of 100. And that may not always be true, but it's very, very often. Especially for the sessions which I've attended, it's incredibly rare. I don't even know if there was an occasion where light was reflecting upward. I mean, the model can lay on their back so that the features which usually don't capture light are given more highlights than usual, but that's to do more with the pose than to do with the direction of the light. Now I've obviously drawn in the right arm on the left, one which crosses over the body, which shows how much you have as far as blocking of the pose, because that's a big shape to get in initially. And then you can completely avoid putting in features for the head, but for this pose I do concentrate for too long on trying to render the hair and the ears and the shape of the face, so you can see the direction that the head is slightly turned and tilted. Things like that are always just too tempting to get into, so I very rarely manage to concentrate on the more important aspects of a life drawing pose. But before too long I remember that you have to try and get as much detail and accuracy on the pose as possible, and if you're concentrating too much on one aspect of the pose, then the rest will suffer. Now from this angle I'm filming from a very low position, so certain proportions will look incredibly foreshortened. So I will show an image at the end of this video of a straight on photograph of the drawing that I'm making. But here you can just see that certain parts of the pose I'm now going in a little bit darker, adding bits of shadow. It is a conscious choice of whether to go in with heavy rendering or not, which just means that if you really want to render shadow on the pose, that's a decision of focusing, instead of where the shadow is, focusing on where the highlights are, and then avoiding that lightest area on the subject and giving everything else a slight tone. And then once the only part which is white is the very lightest part of the subject, then you can start working in shadow and darker midtones once everything else has a tone of a very light midtone, just to distinguish it and separate it from the highlights. That's not something which I'm doing in this pose, but I will do in another video, and I do learn a lot from doing things like that. It's amazing how much life drawing exposes how much you aren't used to drawing the human form and not really being so familiar with what you're looking at, unless of course you're very experienced. And I've done a hell of a lot of life drawing, and yet I still feel as though I need to check and double check and triple check with every mark that I'm making that I'm sure that what I'm drawing is accurate. Because if I weren't able to look at a reference, I don't think a lot of these details would sit the way that they do. It's things where I try to learn from the reference as much as I can how things actually look in reality, so that if I do draw from imagination, these can be little memory banks of how things turned out in a life drawing session or a portrait drawing session where I did have reference to use. Because I'm onto a darker piece of charcoal, I'm going to certain areas on this drawing to try and ensure that there's a balance of darks, and that will be in the eyes, around the armpits, certain lines that just become heavier, but I want to try and balance it across the drawing so that it's not focused in one area and then creating an imbalanced effect for the whole drawing, because you can even see from this angle how much darker this piece of charcoal is compared to the other marks that I've made that almost look like a brown colour, which can be the effect of charcoal. Now this paper, as I said at the beginning, is very smooth. It's presentation pad paper, but I don't think that really hurts because it doesn't make it difficult for the drawing. It's not necessarily what you're recommended to use by experienced artists, but I found it to be an interesting surface to draw on, just because when you have a lot of grain and texture to a piece of paper that you're drawing on, it's sometimes hard to get a straight line and to have the marks go uninterrupted. So to know for a fact that that won't happen with the presentation pad is one of the bonuses of using it. Although it's not my preferred surface, it's just the largest pad that I had available, so I've used it several times. I do use a bit of smudging here. It's a nice way of creating a bit of mid-tone, and light mid-tone at that. I say it's a nice way, it's a fast and convenient way. Again, I apologise for the lack of focus in some of these shots. Smudging is not something which a lot of artists like or appreciate, but that is something where it can be useful. Ideally, I wouldn't smudge a drawing if I had enough time. I would try to shade lighter. That is the preferred technique, for certain artists at least. And I think those are artists who have had the greatest influence on me. I think I'm going to have to cut out a lot of this part. So it is just a case of going from top to bottom, ensuring that the lines are clean and that you have certain dark areas that are high contrast to attract the eye. In retrospect, I should have filmed this from a different angle, but I'm glad that I captured it at all. It's usually the last thing on my mind when I'm joining a life drawing session. I apologise for the out of focus shot. I believe that's the end of the pose. I'm now working on another drawing. So there it is, back into focus for a moment, and you can see that it's mostly a line drawing, but there are bits of shading just to heighten the sense of depth in certain areas, the curvature of the arm and the folded leg and knee. It was a relatively short pose, but I do find it an interesting position to draw. And here to give you a better example of what it looks like is a photograph. I hope you enjoyed that. Okay, so that's the drawing done. The session was really good and interesting as far as different poses to try and tackle. It's always a bit more of a challenge when you're, given a deadline of a certain amount of time in which to try and capture the likeness. But it's always good practice. I highly recommend, if you enjoy drawing, to attend life drawing sessions, just because it gets you used to working within certain time constraints and learning how to render form in different abstract ways. And if you do get the opportunity, then to try and get more realistic, lifelike detail into the drawing. But in my experience, it's rare that you actually get the opportunity to start to work on detail and texture. It's often more to do with the pose and to do with the direction and the dynamism and the real capturing the gestural impact, of the pose. That's really the focus of doing a life drawing session in my experience. But I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a like, comment down below, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and I will see you in the next video.